again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. Do you know anyone who's ever committed murder? What happened? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. One of the most intelligent men I knew, my former boss R, passed away of old age last year. When he was 16, which would have been in the 1940s, his mostly absentee degenerate doper father showed up, took R's younger sister in the garage, and beat her almost bloody with a belt. R arrived just in time to roll up the garage door and told the old man, "You ever touch her again, I'll kill you." The next day after school, he comes home to hear his sister screaming in the garage. He goes in the house, grabs Dad's shotgun, rolls up the door, tells Sis to run, and shoots and kills the son-of-a-bitch. R was taken to juvie till trial. Sister was sent to live with an aunt. At trial, the local Baptist pastor told the small-town judge he and his wife would legally adopt R. Judge declared the killing justified, and R grew up safe and loved, and got a degree in psychology. He told me the adoptive parents were his real parents. So I was newly pregnant and meeting the rest of my family-in-laws during a holiday gathering. I met the aunt who used to be a rising star in LA as a model featured in magazines. If I recall correctly, she spent 17 years in prison because she was a drug mule transporting drugs during her modeling gigs. Anyway, I also met her boyfriend. He was charming, and my 6-year-old son loved him. Heck, I was swooned by his charisma. When I left the family dinner, I was informed he was recently out of prison because he murdered 2 men and placed them into barrels before dumping them into the sea. Maybe he's a changed man? A year later, I realized I hadn't heard about this man in a while. When I asked the in-laws, there was a sudden silence. That's when I found out he murdered another man and tried dumping the body with the same method. You'd think he would have learned his lesson by now. Awkward part is, he left behind a barrel in the house where I'm staying at. It took me 2 years before I pried it open out of curiosity. It was camping gear. Thank you, baby Jesus. Guy across the hall was a cool guy. Super laid back, worked at a restaurant, and always brought us leftover food, which was cool because we were all poor college students. Used to go over there and play retro video games and drink beers. He'd always tell us about his girlfriend, who was so busy with school he hardly saw her. Never thought much about it. Turns out, she dumped him a while back, and he's been stalking her. Ended up going to her house one night and very brutally murdering her while she was on the phone with her parents, sentenced to life in prison. I knew a man years ago who killed a man in a bar fight. He hit the person in the head with a pool ball. He was tried and convicted of negligent homicide and served 18 months in prison. I knew him 15 years later, and he'd never been arrested for anything since, and freely admitted he was wrong. It was a heat-of-the-moment thing. He said he never thought it would have killed someone. I met a lady one time who told me her husband had abused her for years before she got away from him. She had a restraining order and kept a weapon on her due to being scared of not being in a position to defend herself. One day, she was at the gas station and he pulled up to the pump right on the other side of her. He came at her and she bent down and pulled the knife out of the holster. When she came up, she stabbed him in the heart from under his ribs. He died. She walked free. My best friend in high school had a boyfriend who creeped me the F out. I had been slowly removing myself from our friendship because of his influence when I got a call from her telling me that he was on his way to pick her up and that he'd murdered his parents. I told her to hang up and call 911. His mom survived multiple gunshots. Sadly, his dad did not. My father killed my mother and made it look like a suicide. He admitted it to my sister after he had a stroke and lost his ability to filter his mouth. She was getting 100% disability from the Veterans Administration, as was he. He liked to spend his money on beer and hookers. Saw him once when she was hospitalized. Wanted her to cover the bills. He got nearly as much in a widower's benefit from the VA as she was getting for disability. He was bragging the day before the funeral about how much he would be getting. Who does that? He was so greedy and sadistic, I knew he did it all along. He'd abused my mother to the point that she would break down and have to be hospitalized for up to a year. She was disabled due to having contracted malaria during World War II in the Philippines and having a high fever that normally kills, but in her case she survived with severe nervous system problems, very sensitive and vulnerable. He sent her to the hospital many times in the 14 years that they were married and forged his name to her savings where the VA had deposited her checks previously while she was hospitalized. He stole her money every time, and yet the police believed him when he lied and said he never abused her or anyone else. He would beat all of us when we lived with him. My grandmother hired an attorney to go talk to investigators several months after the funeral, but they said the case was closed and refused to hear anything. I mean, there's really not much to say besides kind of a piece of crap human being. I know it's your father, so I'm sorry, but, that's pretty terrible, man. I hope you're doing well. My daughter shot and killed her abusive ex-boyfriend in front of me. She had come to stay with us to get safe from him. Every day we caught him in the yard. Every day we called the cops. Every day they did nothing. When he showed up and tried to force his way into the house, daughter grabbed a gun. Told the cops she had a gun. The cops are 2 miles away. They never show. 20 minutes later, he gets sick of waiting on her to give up and charges her. She shoots him at close range. I tell the police she has shot him and he's on the ground. 15 minutes later, one lone patrolman shows up, sees him on the ground and says, "What's the matter with him?" No ambulance ever showed up, even though he was alive for a while after he was shot. They had a restraining order on him. We had called daily for a week. They still arrested her for killing him. You know how a grand jury meets once a month to decide if they will proceed with prosecution? They didn't decide for 2 years. Then, they let her go as a good shoot. They could have told us that before we spent $20,000 on defense attorneys. And no, we didn't get the money back, even though he never had to defend her. My late mother's boyfriend at the time, he randomly attacked and killed a woman walking her dog with his bare hands. He was caught inside of a couple of days, but what really stuck with me was how he came home with his hands beat up, saying that he fell while on a hike. Obviously, it was right after the murder, but we could not have known that at the time. He was completely chill in every respect, while my mom helped clean him up. In retrospect, it was a bit of a stretch to say it was from a hiking accident, but he sold it well, and I was young, and my mom would not have any reason to expect murder of all things. I'm getting ready for school, and a couple cops show up to the house asking about my mom's boyfriend. He did not come home the night prior, and as this was back before the days of cell phones, she was concerned. I went to school, but was pulled out early by my uncle, where he told me my mom was going to let me know what was happening. I get to my aunt's house, and she tells me what happened. My mom was devastated. We would see the story on the news that night, and it showed his prior convictions. He was arrested several times for SA and violent crimes. We had no idea. We even met his extended family. They never said a word about his past. I don't know that we were ever in danger, but my mom and him dated for 3 years, lived together for 2 years. He thankfully was caught, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. Hung out a bunch of times with a friend and his coworker who lived in a pretty sketchy neighborhood. At some point it came up that several years before he was walking home and a guy tried to rob him at knife point. It turned into a scuffle, and the coworker turned the knife and drove it into the robber with what turned out to be a fatal stab wound. The cops obviously got involved. The coworker had never been arrested while the robber had a long criminal history, including violent acts, and so there were never any charges. He didn't like to talk about it though, kinda effed him up for a good while, even though he was in the right. I know a guy who ran over his girlfriend's head with his car twice because he thought she was cheating on him. He's serving a life sentence now. While in prison, a much older woman who worked in the kitchen fell in love with him and they married. She doesn't work there anymore. He then converted to Islam, and now whenever she visits, she has to be fully covered from head to toe. Wackos, both of them. My old barber murdered someone when he was 17 and served somewhere around 12 to 13 years. I was pretty young when he did it, but we knew each other back then. We got really cool when he started cutting my hair after he got out, but he def had a negative tick to him. You could tell when he was having a bad day. We talked about anything that was going on around us, but I never asked or mentioned anything about what he did. Never talked about it at all. I graduated high school in 2001. A guy in the class of 1998 was a wrestler and an overall popular guy. He was huge, and even in 2019 still held the school deadlift record for his weight class. We'll call him Frank. Well, I was working as a corrections officer in 2004, and one day in the early evening, Frank was brought into booking by the sheriff's department. The charge was second-degree murder. He claimed that he got into a fight with an undocumented immigrant and shot him in self-defense. However, the evidence showed the victim was hit 3 times with a blunt object and shot in the back of the head, apparently from the kneeling position. This all taking place in an abandoned farmhouse that neither had any association with. Frank, being much bigger and stronger than the victim, his story didn't convince a jury, and he was found guilty and sentenced to life without parole. I was also working that day, and they had to carry him back to the jail. He was sobbing uncontrollably. Normally, an inmate sentenced to state prison is transported within a week. They took Frank 3 hours later. I guess due to his prolific case, or maybe because of his size and suicidal risk. I saw a lot of people I knew pass through that jail during the 5 years I worked there, but I'll never forget Frank. My brother-in-law is in prison for life for killing his ex-friend with benefits who was married. It was really hard on the family, but he had a history of being mentally unstable and stalking women. For whatever reason, a local police department still hired him. When he got hired, I called the chief of chiefs in the area, who was a personal friend, told him about the stalking and erratic behavior, and I could not be trusted with a gun. No lie. 3 months later, right before Christmas, same guy calls to tell us that my brother-in-law had just confessed to murder. I haven't spoken to that friend since. He could have literally prevented this from happening, but he did nothing. Still makes me so sick to think about it. He was an asshole in school, never gave a shit about doing the right thing, always purposely pissing the teachers off, but his older brother was the opposite, loved by everyone, an all-around goofy person, worked with little kids in his free time and after graduation. He went into his older brother's room, held a gun to his head and asked, "Are you feeling lucky?" and pulled the trigger. It was a huge loss to our community and school district. I believe the younger brother was released early from prison due to the downsizing during COVID. No idea where he is now. My next-door neighbor shot and killed his father when I was maybe 10 years old. I think he was a junior or senior in high school at the time, and always getting into trouble, and I mean always. It was a school day, and before school, he got into an argument with his father and didn't want to go to school. They kept arguing, then he went and got his father's gun and shot him. He then ran across the street to our other neighbor, where my mother just happened to be there talking to her friend. He was out of breath and told them, "I've done something terrible, I just shot my father." My mother and her friend called the police and ran over to find him laying on his back with a gunshot wound to his abdomen. My mother had some medical training, so she's trying to help him the best she can. Ambulance and at least 10 cop cars show up and take over. He didn't run off and was arrested on the spot. I don't remember how many years he got, but I never saw him again. His mother continued to live in the house for a few years, but couldn't take the memories anymore and moved to live with her family. A patient, when they were a minor, they had a mental break and killed their entire household save for 2 younger siblings in a retaliation for SA. They had been institutionalized for their entire life thereafter. But when I knew them much later in life, they were a heck of a nice person, especially when I was brand new. Would tell me where the supplies and whatnot were kept, would also look out for other patients on the unit, and would give me a heads up if one was out of sorts. 2 clients at the vet clinic I work at have been charged with murder. One was charged with second degree for killing her son. She was convicted of a lesser charge of manslaughter. She claims it was accidental. I kinda believe it. Her son was not okay. Terrible addiction, mental health problems, and he was abusive to her. She'll be sentenced this month. The other has been charged with first-degree murder of her mother. Both of her cats were surrendered to the shelter. We work closely with the shelter. Due to mental health issues on the daughter's part prior to the murder, so obviously we're speculating that either her mother surrendered the cats and pissed the daughter off, or the daughter surrendered them knowing she was planning this and would be getting locked up. Obviously, we have no idea if either is true, but we can't help but speculate. The first lady I've interacted with multiple times. She seems very nice, if maybe a bit troubled. I don't live in a high-crime area, so it's a bit weird that it's two, although the first one took place far from here. Not exactly a murder, but when I was very young, my stepfather hung himself in our barn. My mother saw him, loaded his kids in the car, drove us to my grandparents' house, then went back and called 911. I can't prove it, but I think she was hoping to kill time so that he would die. He didn't. I taught alongside a woman who would walk with her son to school every morning. He would walk with her and then go on his campus. We worked at the middle school and he attended high school. He was a pretty good kid, it seemed. At the very least, he was always polite to me. She was found murdered that summer. It was pretty brutal. A bunch of us teachers went to her service and her son, almost 18, gave the eulogy. We all hugged and comforted him afterwards. It was now sometimes later that the son had been arrested for the crime. He was convicted and is now serving life. Don't remember if there's a chance of parole. Working at Courtesan back in 2005, I was hired by a couple to be their human toy. They were both heavy drinkers. He was an absolute narcissist, and she could never do enough to make him happy. I would stay overnight. This went on for about 6 months, but his treatment of his wife was too much for me to continue seeing them. About 6 months later, I had a call from him requesting an overnight because his wife had died. My first thought was wondering how he had killed her. I agreed to go out for dinner with him just so I could look him into his eyes and see the truth. She had died from cyanide poisoning. His story didn't make sense to me, but I wasn't sure how to approach the police with my suspicions. It turned out I didn't need to. A detective reached out to me after he found my details on his computer during the investigation. I met the detective for coffee. We were both convinced he had killed his wife. I was asked if I would continue to see him in the hope he would confess to me. He didn't. But he did end up dying from pancreatic cancer, so that was a good thing. I often think back now and wonder what on earth the police were thinking, having me in such a position. A short piece for 60 Minutes or 2020 was made about the case called Tainted Love. I appeared in it, with my voice changed and my face blurred. I didn't want to do any of this, but felt compelled to try and get justice for her. My great-great-grandmother murdered my great-great-grandfather. My great-grandmother Gigi told me the story. When Gigi was 16, she was about to get married. On the fateful day, her father came in from the field for lunch and calmly told her mother he was bringing another woman home for dinner, and that she was to be served dinner before he would take her upstairs to do the thing. When dinner came, he brought a 12-year-old girl to the table. Gigi's mother served the girl, let her husband take her upstairs, and followed a few minutes later with a loaded shotgun. When she opened the door, he had just dropped his pants, so she shot at his groin. She sat and watched him bleed to death as the young girl said thanks and left. I'm proud of that badass woman in my bloodline. I know 3. One was a manslaughter charge. He was driving drunk and hit a woman. He drove away from the scene because he didn't realize he had hit anyone, and by the time he was arrested he was sober, so they couldn't prove he was drunk. Otherwise, he would have gone to jail for much longer. He's now out, sober, and has really turned his life around. Proud of him. The second guy was legitimately insane. I'm not sure about his specific diagnosis, but he was a genuinely dangerous person. He decided to go off his meds without telling anyone, and when his therapist did a home call on him, he murdered her. He's in a state mental hospital for the rest of his life. The third guy was an ultra-Christian who didn't believe in divorce. He started cheating on his wife and decided he didn't want to be married anymore, but divorce is a sin. So somehow it made sense to murder her instead. Anyway, he got a first-degree charge and will never walk free again. Thank God.